My name is John Deedy, professor of political science at the community colleges of Baltimore County and local political analyst. Welcome to the Maryland State Politics and Government podcast on Substack. Today, I am talking with Delegate Ryan Nawrocki, from the 7th District of the state of Maryland, representing in the House of Delegates. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, John. Hope you're having a great day.
So far, so good. I can't complain.
Good.
My first question I want to ask today is, what are your goals for this legislative session?
Sure. Well, I think that the two overarching themes for this legislative session are affordability, and that means a lot of things. That's talking about kind of the escalation of energy prices that we've seen in Maryland over the past several years. That's also talking about taxes and fees. Unfortunately, we've seen a lot of new taxes and fees over the past several years as well. I think all of those things are driving folks out of the state of Maryland. And that's just not me saying that. The comptroller had a report out a couple weeks ago that said that like 300,000 people have left the state over the past decade or so. And I think a lot of that has to do with affordability. So I think we have to look at how we can lower energy costs and not raise more new taxes and fees, even though we have a budget deficit right now going into this session.
Big problem right now that I'm hearing from a lot of people is they're not talking as much about the budget situation, but it's the energy situation because it's personal. They get that bill from BG&E or wherever, and it's really hitting them hard. I don't want to get into a blame game, but when you think about who's at fault, how much is BG&E at fault? How much are the various regulators at fault? Where's kind of the fault and blame on this? Because there's a lot of finger pointing going on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of fault to be shared amongst all of those individuals and amongst the legislature as well in this process. We just had some of my colleagues and I just had a multi-state energy hearing this past Friday. We had legislators join us from Pennsylvania and New Jersey in Annapolis. And the problems we're seeing in Maryland are not necessarily just unique to Maryland. These are regional issues inside of our power grid, and a lot of it has to do with bad policy. I'll give you an example of one of those policies. So, there's something called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Regardless of how you feel about sort of global warming or climate change, whichever way you want to characterize it, by being a part of that, many states have been unable to build new generation facilities. So as a matter of fact, Pennsylvania just voted almost unanimously in a very bipartisan way to withdraw from that initiative to be able to bring new power plants online in Pennsylvania to help solve this problem inside of the grid. So I think that some of it's legislative. I think that, some of those like BG and some of our other utilities, they're not always there fighting out for the ratepayer to keep costs low. A good example of that is transmission lines. We have a potentially large transmission line project running through my district for the Brandon Shores power plant. And instead of what's called regenerating lines and kind of putting existing infrastructure, upgrading existing infrastructure, there's an incentive, a financial incentive for companies like BG to build new lines in tandem with that because they can then charge more money for it. So there's a perverse incentive there for the utility companies to do so. So I think that there's multiple areas here where it's utility companies, it's policy. There's multiple things that have led to this problem, which really is a simple supply and demand problem. We've had a number of power plants. If the Brandon Shores and Wagner power plants go offline, it would be about 8 power plants have gone offline in the past decade or so without bringing on any new large-scale generation.
One of the big problems that people have missed on this is the fact that everyone talks about AI. We got to go all in on AI. AI requires a lot of electricity. What are your thoughts about how do we deal with building an AI industry in the state of Maryland to help create jobs? But at the same time, we can't depend on the state of Pennsylvania to supply the electricity to do all this.
Yes, that's exactly right. I mean, I think one of the ways that you could do this is Pennsylvania, for instance, is moving towards legislation that would require these data centers to be sited either at a power plant or to require them to come up with their own power supply somehow. One of the ways I think you could do that is for instance, is to site a third nuclear reactor at Calvert Cliffs That facility has been asking for it. The community is supportive of it. Granted, that is a little bit of a long-term goal because you can't just, nuclear reactors take a while to build. But I think that's one way that you could look at it. Another way that you could look at it is we have a number of power plants that we've taken offline. Now, some of those that we've taken offline, all the infrastructure is gone. But that is not the case for all of them. I'll give you an example. We had one in my district. It's the CP Crane plant. It was a coal-fired plant. The plant is now gone, but the utility infrastructure, the grid infrastructure is still there. It's so much there, in fact, that they're going to actually put a large battery storage facility there. But places like that where you have that infrastructure that already exists, I think that would be the kind of places to look in the near term to invest in whether that's natural gas. You can build and site permit natural gas relatively quickly in comparison to some things like nuclear. You could site them there at those kinds of sites. They were already power plants in the past, with the long-term goal of maybe moving towards something like small modular nuclear reactors, which is, I think, a very exciting technology. There are some of these already being built around the country. There's one being built in Tennessee. There's another one being built in Texas that will be online, hopefully within the next several years. But these are nuclear reactors, not in the sense of how, our grandparents thought about nuclear reactors, these big facilities, but much smaller, could be about the size of a trailer, of a tractor trailer. The military is already using this kind of technology, and they have for a very long time. We've had nuclear-powered submarines and battleships and things like that for a long time. So these small reactors are not something new, but they would be new in the conventional sense of using them for communities to power energy. I think that's a way going forward that you could power our grid in a clean and responsible way as well.
Next question I'll ask is along the lines of currently the state has not just a structural deficit, but a situation where we had a huge deficit this year. Let's say that the governor came to you and said, Ryan, what would you do to reduce this deficit? Here is the pen, cross off what you think needs to be done, get rid of whatever programs, etc., or deal with some fee things. What would you do?
Sure. I mean, I think that the only way to get serious about the deficit problem that we have is to have a very frank discussion about the blueprint or the Kerwin plan, whichever way you want to describe it. That is ultimately the long-term driver of our deficits. I like some things inside of Kerwin. There's some things that I'm not necessarily in love with, but one of the mechanisms inside of the bill when it was originally passed was a mechanism to pause Kerwin. Doesn't mean that we have to repeal it. Doesn't mean that we have to not move forward in the future. But I think when you continue to see these big year after year deficits, I think that's exactly why a pause mechanism was placed inside of the original legislation. I think now is a very good time to hit that pause button and to allow us to figure out how we may fund that in the future. But right now, with our economy being what it is, we know that the state of Maryland has lost about 25,000 federal jobs, for instance, in the past year. There are very real economic factors at play right now in the state that I think would necessitate us at least to have a real discussion about pausing that piece of legislation. That solves a lot of the immediate budget issues, and not just this year, but the immediate within the next, say, 3 to 5 years.
One of the things you've been recently talking about, a possible need for the state of Maryland, is having a state inspector general. Mm-hmm. Why do you feel this is needed, and where would you put the chances of getting something like that done as early as this year, knowing you got to get some Democrats to say, yeah, I agree with that idea too?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I think these transparency measures are just important. I think the taxpayer should know definitively what's going on with their tax dollars. That's why I also, by the way, have a bipartisan bill with Senator Carl Jackson to expand the authority of the Inspector General in Baltimore County to be able to look at the school system. That's the biggest part of the school system, is the biggest part of the county's budget in Baltimore County, over 50%. Same logic applies at the state level. This is not a inventing the wheel kind of idea. Pennsylvania has one. Virginia has one, for instance. Many states around us have a state office of the Inspector General. I think the chances maybe are sort of low at this point to move it this year, but I just think it's good government legislation. I'll give you an example with the Inspector General in Montgomery County. They, a couple years ago, expanded the authority of that office to include the school system. And within a few years, that inspector general's office had saved the taxpayers in Montgomery County by just being able to look at the school system in addition to the rest of county government, like $30 million. I think if you were to think about that at the state level with a budget that's $67 billion, there's probably some efficiencies to be gained. And that doesn't even necessarily mean, John, that people are doing things in a nefarious way. A lot of what the Inspector General of Montgomery County found was just you could do things in a better way to save money. Look, there could be nefarious things happening, but taking that aside, like I think we should be doing everything we can when we're in these tight budget circumstances to try to save money to be able to potentially use that in other areas that we need to inside of our budget.
One of the things about an Office of Inspector General is using the example of Isabel Cumming and Kelly Madigan. At times, they are looked at as the good housekeeping seal of approval. When they say there's waste, fraud, and abuse, no one argues. Why do you think there's a reluctance in state government to do something like this, especially recently with the Moore administration and the fact that there's a whistleblower that's come forward on a variety of things, and it seems like they're doing more to discredit the whistleblower than to say, hey, this is a serious matter?
Yeah, I think, John, that there could be a fundamental misunderstanding of what an inspector general is. And I've encountered this with my Baltimore County bill with Senator Jackson. A lot of people think that auditors and audits are what an inspector general does. And so there's been a big education process. I saw, for instance, Senate President Ferguson on TV the other day saying, well, we don't need this because we already have a Department of Legislative Audits and they already look at this stuff. And that's true. And I think those folks do good work. But an auditor is very different than an inspector general. Inspector generals, for instance, have subpoena power. They can compel testimony. That's very different. They can use investigative tools that an auditor doesn't. An auditor comes in and says, Department X, I want to look at your books from this date to this date. They give all this information in advance. They tell them exactly what they're looking for, all those kinds of things. An inspector general may or may not tell the folks that they're doing something with. They might be doing an investigation behind the scenes. They might be subpoenaing information that those people don't even know is being looked at. And so the process is fundamentally different than audits. And I think that there is a part of it is an education piece to get people to understand that, like, just because we have audits doesn't mean we have these kinds of inspections going in Maryland.
One of the issues that has come up a lot over the last year with the decrease in crime in Baltimore County is still the big problem is juvenile crime. What do you think the legislature can do this session to deal with that issue to help people like Ivan Bates and people in Baltimore feel a lot safer, but also deal with that problem?
Sure. Well, part of and certainly there has been on the books a decrease in juvenile crime, but part of the reason, if you talk to any of the state's attorneys, like State's Attorney Bates or State's Attorney Schellenberger in Baltimore County, they'll tell you that part of the decrease is attributed to the fact that we cannot charge juveniles for many of the crimes that we historically had charged them for, right? So some of the decrease is just because things aren't able to be reported anymore. I think that's why in some communities they're saying, you know what, we're not necessarily feeling this quote unquote decrease in crime. It's simply because we're not charging these juveniles anymore with these types of crimes that we may have in the past. I think that, one of the things that we can do is make sure that we don't move. There's a measure, for instance, that would limit the ability to charge juveniles that have committed particularly heinous crimes like murder, like first-degree rape, that would limit the ability to charge them as an adult. Many states' attorneys in a bipartisan way have said that that is not a good thing. I think that we should not move a measure like that forward this year in Annapolis. I don't think that would help. But the other thing that I think that we need to look at is how we're communicating the information amongst the various places that a juvenile may interact with. When you talk to the school system, for instance, often they'll tell you that like a juvenile might have been charged with a crime, and they don't know that inside of the school system. So I think that somehow there's a fundamental breakdown because, in some cases, the school system would want to know, hey, this kid got in a fight with another kid and they happen to go to the same school. It would be useful information for them to know in that school so that they could potentially prevent something from happening inside of the school property. So I think that like communication is also key. And I think kind of trying to break down some of those silos could be very helpful in this process.
One thought I had as far as a lot of this, it puzzles me when you said this. Why and who are the people who are saying, let's not be as hard on juveniles as we need to be? Where is that coming from? Because it confuses me.
Yeah, I think that there is a perception that that it's just, you want to lock everybody up and throw away the key, and that's simply not the case. I mean, a lot of the reasons why you would want a judge involved in a process is not necessarily to even, send a juvenile to a detention facility, but to ensure that certain services are offered to the child, to make sure that the child is actually like showing up for those services. Because I think that early intervention, the sooner that we can get to some of these kids, the better. And when you take the court system out of that process, you lose some of those tools that require intervention to occur. Because look, when a judge says that something has to occur, it has to occur. If some others, say that this would be a good idea for it to occur for a child, it may or may not occur. But when a judge is involved, it forces that process to occur. And that, by the way, John, is not necessarily always just to say that that child needs to be placed in some sort of detention facility. That may be the case, for certain crimes, if it's a particularly violent crime, or if we see there's a child, for instance, that I can tell you has committed in excess of 60 auto thefts in eastern Baltimore County. If you see a child doing something like that over and over and over again, something's broken there, in that household, that we need more serious intervention at that point. And that's why you would want the judicial system to be involved in circumstances like that, where you see habitual, repeated offenses, even if they're not necessarily, say, violent crimes.
Wednesday is the day the budget's going to be presented. And I have discovered over the years that the budget is the best kept secret in the state of Maryland. No one leaks nothing, which I give a lot of credit on that. And the anticipation is that they may not deal with the blueprint the way it should be dealt with. But another concern a lot of people have is with the CADE formula and its continued funding. I've talked to some people and they're concerned that they may even decrease CADE funding more for community colleges. Why do you think it's so important to increase CADE funding and to help assist community colleges, considering their enrollment is increasing, but at the same time, K through 12 enrollment is going to be declining for several years?
Absolutely. Well, I think it's important because community colleges play a different role than our four-year institutions in Maryland. And I'll give you some examples. So, Community College of Baltimore County in my district is looking to create a mechanics program for aviation mechanics. That's something that's very different than what you would get, say, at Towson University or the University of Maryland. No knock on those; are all good institutions, but they do different things. I think that what you see often at the community college level are programs that allow folks to either keep on going down the four-year path, or in many cases allows them to enter the workforce immediately, and often with very high-paying jobs. And so I think that there's a net multiplier to what the community college system is doing. That although obviously there's a dollars and cents cost to the budget, there's also a good rate of return when these individuals, say for instance, like the example I'm talking about, when they become a airplane mechanic, they're going to be making a good salary, and they're going to be paying taxes. So they're going to be contributing back to the system in a big way to Baltimore County and to the state of Maryland.
Final question I have is related to some legislation that's been proposed this session. It relates to ICE, and it relates to the idea of passing legislation related to masking, also related to saying we're not going to hire those people who are currently working for ICE that may have been hired during the Trump administration. What are your feelings about this whole situation regarding the first part as far as masking? Because a lot of communities have passed laws saying people can't wear masks, in part in response to COVID. At the same time, you have the history of the Ku Klux Klan, where they're always in masks. But at the same time, you've got the situation, this is law enforcement. How do you feel this issue should be dealt with on the masking? Then you can kind of talk about the issue regarding whether these people should be hired to work in law enforcement in Maryland.
Sure. Well, so the masking part first. It's my understanding that Baltimore County, also the county council, had a measure that they were going to potentially introduce with this as well. And they ultimately did not move forward with that masking provision because they had gotten some guidance that it's probably not constitutional to have a piece of legislation like that. So, if it's not constitutional at the county level, I think the argument still applies at the state level as well. I'm not sure that you can tell the federal department. I'm not sure that a state agency can tell a federal agency how they have to, act and what they can and can't do with respect to their uniform or things like that. So I don't think that if we even pass that bill, I think it could ultimately get struck down in court. And it might feel good for many to pass a measure like that, but I don't think it will hold up in court. And the same argument applies for the whether we should hire folks that were hired during the Trump administration or not. I think that one's even more ridiculous. I think that I don't think that that's constitutional, first of all, to do that. And my question about that would be, where does that stop? You don't like kind of the policies of the Trump administration. I get that. People have different opinions about that. But what happens if someone then comes in and says, well, we've got this precedent of we're not going to hire people based upon this characteristic? What happens if someone comes in next and says, you know what, we're not going to hire someone based upon their skin color, their gender, their ethnicity? I just think that is a very dangerous road to go down, and frankly, I think an unconstitutional road to go down. That just is not smart, and frankly, will ultimately be a big waste of time in Annapolis, because I think ultimately, if we do that, it's going to be struck down in federal court.
You again, Delegate Nawrocki, for taking the time to talk with me today. Take care, have a good day, and good luck this session.
Thank you very much.